I'm sorry, but I really have to say, I find the restriction of this discussion to the triune three elements completely unrealistic, outdated, and non-applicable to the Western world, the European world that I know. Firstly, there is no acknowledgement that these are incredibly and increasingly morphogenetic institutions. They are changing in shape, intensity, and activity with more speed and more depth than ever in human history. But that's not the point I really want to make. It's needed for background. There is something crucial that is absolutely missing here in dealing with these three elements. And this is what I call bureaucratic or administrative regulation. Now, administrative regulation is an admission. It exists in all sorts of domains. Yes, some of it is governmental. No, most of it is not governmental, though. It can pertain to hotels, no pets, no dogs, no cats, no gerbils. It can pertain to railway-owned property, setting of parking rates, designated parking spaces. It can pertain to local government, how you put your refuse out, what days, what containers, in what ways. And why is this the case? Because it does not need to be, and it never is, democratic. Nobody is asked, do you approve of this new method of refuse disposal? Do you approve of the fact that it costs over 200,000 euros to buy one of the refuse collecting vehicles that can deal with this sort of refuse? And not only is it not democratic, but it is not part of the law, because the law cannot cope. You can track the figures. I've written about this in our 5 books on social morphogenesis over the last 5 years. You can track in England and in the EU how the law cannot keep up with change in these domains. And the law has backed off trying to keep up with change in these domains. So we have less laws now than we had 7 years ago, 10 years ago. Instead, we have more bureaucratic regulations. We have regulators for almost every sector: Ofcom, Ofsted, etc., etc. School regulation, utility regulation, communication regulation. We, the public, are never, ever consulted about that, or hospital regulation. Many people have written books on this, but they have not been mentioned in these meetings. Concepts about the regulatory state, the hollowing out of the state, the demise of the old command and control model, which no longer works. Now, the interesting thing in question here is bureaucratic regulation is not normative. It doesn't ask people, do you agree, do you approve, is it ethical? It simply casts them in the role, and here I agree completely, that the individual, methodological individual position is the position of those writing in defense of this triune model, but it simply doesn't work, because bureaucratic regulation works through turning people into precisely instrumental individualists who work through instrumental rationality. So if you park your car outside a railway station, having looked at the board and found out what the daily charges are for parking, and you're a rich individual and say to yourself, well, okay, the penalty is 25 euros. I can afford it. It's worth my while to pay the penalty. You're turned into an instrumental rationalist. And that goes through so much. And I just fail to understand how, we can have a 2-day, 3-day discussion in which bureaucratic regulation does not appear once in any way, shape, or form. And yet, it is so destructive of social integration. I mean, I've talked about this here and about EU regulations on no sale of forked carrots. They must be straight specimens without secondary roots. And this gives the public the impression, because of the pricing of these things, which actually involves the rejection of perfectly edible carrots that happen to have secondary roots and some forking in them, gives the public the impression that carrot growers are doing extremely well. Whereas the carrot grower, who has been had half his products for sale turned away, believes that the public is over-choosy. But it's not the public who's made that choice. But social integration, social solidarity is damaged by such things as that regulation, which is still in force. So, I would like all our speakers to tell me why they neglect bureaucratic regulation.
So, thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesora. La palabra para Stefano Samagna.
No, thank you very much, Adrian. You have produced a very rich paper. I have two specific remarks about which I would like to have your opinion. The first one has to do with the so-called institutional policies. Let me take the case of antitrust policies. As you know, there is a big difference between the United States and the European Union on the antitrust policy. Why is that so? Formally, if you look at the rules, they seem to be more or less equivalent. But that is a very superficial way of reading the rules, because the difference is that has to do with the notion of dominant position and abuse of a dominant position. Now, whereas in the United States, if you have a company and you are detected by the antitrust authority, they do not consider the abuse of power or dominant position per se, but only if that generates inefficient results, which means that for Americans, antitrust was invented to guarantee efficiency. So even though you are as big as Google, and you can generate results which are efficient, in this case, they can lower the marginal cost of production, that is okay. In Europe, on the other hand, the dominant position is penalized because it is a threat to liberty. So efficiency versus liberty. And that is a point which is, as far as I know, never been raised, even in international. So there is a sort of a dialogue among deaf people, because everybody talks about antitrust policy, but with different. In the case of the United States, it's a bit problematic, as Jeffrey was saying yesterday, because we should know that in 1795, Albert Gallatin, who was one of the signatory of the American independence, and then he became, under Jefferson president, the Minister of Treasury, he addressed the Congress 1795, where he said, I quote by heart, this nation was born on the principle of political democracy, but be careful, Because unless political democracy is supported by economic democracy, political democracy will not last. So the following events, because the Sherman Act was approved in 1891, in a sense represents a contradiction to what the signatory of the American independence said. The other point is the following, partly related. As you know, you mentioned the concentration of economic power these days. That is terribly true, unfortunately. But those who defend the ideology of free market, they reason in the following way. This is a recent argument they have put forward in the last few months. They say, why, in particular Europeans, make such a fuss against the big five, the big the giant corporation? After all, we should respond to consumers. So if the consumers buy our products and they are happy to buy them, why you are bothering us? Because after all, the ultimate judges are our consumers. That is, by the way, the reason why Leonardo Becchetti and others, they insist so much about voting by wallet. Now, this is an aporetic argument. Where is the aporia? In the fact that the fact that you choose something with no coercion does not guarantee that you consent on the consequences stemming from the choice. There is only one case when that is true, when the chooser can, in a sense, be put in a condition of fixing the choice set. But if the choice set is chosen by somebody else, by the corporation, and you are asked to choose, then you cannot say that you are justifying that behavior. And again, I don't know if you think that this, in this particular day, a strong argument to counter it or to perhaps stop this tremendous concentration of economic power. Thank you.
Gracias, profesor Samagni. El profesor Evers.
So don't be afraid, I will be very, very short. First short remark, you can take it or not, is that I think the interrelation between liberal democracy and the civil society is much more complicated as it came out here. Because on the one hand, and that would be the pro-liberal argument, it's a deep liberal achievement to have this plurality and have this semi-independence of a civil society after all. It's a product of what Michael Walzer once has called the big art of separation, the big achievement and art of separation, separating the power of the state from the society and from the powers of the market. So there's a pro-liberal element in it. I think the problem with the pro-liberal element is that different as well to what you said about we should have a participation of democratically governed organizations. Well, in fact, the civil society is much richer than the liberal idea is, because it entails a lot of community-based organizations, organizations with long traditions, etc. And so between the mafia and the democratically controlled organizations, there's a plurality and vast array of organizations, among them, for instance, the church, which you couldn't simply phrase as democratically governed, but which to participate may be perfect legitimacy. And that raises a lot of problems, for instance, in my country, with the participation of the Muslim organizations at round tables of the government, of a Christ-democratic government, who has to negotiate with these organizations. I just say it's problematic, it should be faced, and it's about, let's say, we spoke about the ambivalence, the ambivalence of some arrangement, and there's a deep ambivalence in what liberal democracy has achieved and the problems we have in a liberal concept here. My question is to the second point you had, and it relates to a point we rightly discussed yesterday, and we ended without a clue. It was a question Jeffrey Sachs took up. What kind of links between the forces of civil society and the forces that represent state power, amongst them, for instance, party coalitions, etc., what kind of links can establish a political will which can change the framework wherein we act, etc.? You have, I welcome this very much, spoken here and spoken in the speech about kind of constitutional reform needed. So maybe you could give a clue a little bit what kind of constitutional reforms could help when we face this question of how to build alliances between civil society forces and forces which are nearer to the state, like the party system, etc. Thank you.
Gracias. Creo que había otra pregunta aquí al frente. ¿No? Bien. Profesor Anet, me parece si haya tiempo que había levantado la mano.
I just wanted to ask Adrian, I think the point he raised about debt was an extremely important point, and you know, I'd like to hear to elaborate more on that. For this reason, from my perspective anyway as an economist, when you have a borrowing contract, you have a risk-free interest rate component, and then you have a component that represents risk. The whole point of the component that represents risk means you can lose big, but that's not what happens. That's not what happens. If you look at the global financial crisis in the US, the creditors were bailed out and the borrowers, especially the homeowners, were left high and dry. This also happens between countries. Like Northern Europe extended huge loans to Southern Europe. Southern Europe went belly up. We know which countries we're talking about. But, you know, there was massive austerity imposed on them, partly to punish them, and that's Luigi's demerits, I think, to punish them for their sins, and also to tell them that you need to repay us. Now, at the Bretton Woods conference, John Maynard Keynes basically tried to have a more balance between the responsibilities of creditors and debtors. But the Americans, who were big creditors at the time, said, no way, now they're big debtors, so it's a different situation. But I think this is a very important point, and I know Adrian has some very interesting ideas on that, and I was just curious if he could say a little bit more about that.
Two small questions. One is, the question about bureaucracy, I think is very important, and regulation on one side. I think that there is also good regulation when it unleash the action of the civil society, so it can be even virtuous. Like, for example, we have Samaritan law, which helps hotel and restaurants to give food, or I think point tariff in sense of review waste. But I think a point which is important that maybe you raised is that in our world, I think in the end, politicians are accountable because they look at polls, we vote them. Companies are becoming accountable with our ratings and things. The real problem is that bureaucrats are not accountable. And even we don't have a metrics. Still, I mean, we don't have an established metrics to evaluate them. While I think we should start doing it, because bureaucrats can be really a force that paralyzes any change. And basically, given that they're not accountable, we cannot act against them. We cannot replace if they're not good. So I think this is really something that has been neglected so far and should be taken more into account. Another point was a technical point, because when you said, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but sometimes you said that any debt, in the end, it's matched by an asset, but the value of the debt can be much higher than the value of the assets, because the asset depreciates if the debt remains there. So, I mean, that's not such a consolation that you have an asset matching the debt, because if you didn't pay at the beginning, you remain with the debt that's much higher than the assets.
Gracias, profesor Becchetti. ¿Habría alguna otra pregunta o intervención? Bueno, creo que tenemos muy buenas preguntas. Adelante, profesor.
Well, thank you all very, very much indeed for all the comments and questions. I hope I can do some justice to some of them. And I think I'll just go back to the first set of comments by Luigino and try and sort of work through the rest. So, very good question. Why do we want to inject solidarity into state and market? Isn't there a case for saying that that's not the right place? And I think you're absolutely right to say that there are other principles at work, and they are important, you know, justice, impartiality, and so on, and that we shouldn't necessarily consider citizens as friends or clients as kind of brothers and sisters. So I accept all of that, and I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize it. I suppose what I would say is that much of, it applies to the other points I've made as well. I think it's simply the imbalance between those more impersonal standards and the more personal ones or interpersonal ones that I do think we need. And I think the reason why we do need them is because we are seeing quite high levels of distrust in a lot of institutions, right? And that applies to not just to bankers, but also to other institutions. So I think in order to restore an element of trust and more potential for cooperation, I think other mechanisms are needed. So I'm not saying that the ones you've mentioned aren't important, but I think we've gone too far down the road of the impersonal. And I think we need to have a greater sense of the interpersonal. So some solidarity in those institutions, I think, is necessary. So for instance, the point is, yes, on one level, we want to treat citizens universally, but to treat people in a just way doesn't mean to treat them the same way. You need forms of judgment. Different people have different needs, and that needs to be reflected much more in public policy than I think it is. So I think the great paradox we have, or maybe that's actually less of a paradox than a contradiction, is that we talk about the personalization of services, and yet we see we see just the opposite, which is it's becoming increasingly impersonal. One model of care, one model of education, one model of welfare. I mean, I think it's encapsulated by our supermarkets. We talk about personalized, consumer culture, and yet you go to a supermarket, there are no persons. You do your own checkout, which means that now the consumer is also a co-worker. So just as you're going shopping, there's nothing like a personal service. You're having to do the checkout yourself. And I think that kind of encapsulates what's going on. I think and increasingly the state operates in a similar sort of way, endless call lines where you talk to computers, not to human beings. And when people talk about their, encounters with the welfare state, I think what they most of all complain about is the lack of responsiveness to individual needs. So in that sense, I think we need much more of it. Again, I agree with you that one can't totally do away with elements of hierarchy, obedience, efficiency in business. You can't run a business as if it was the same as politics, where you constantly vote on everything. Just like, you couldn't have an army or science also, just running on the principles of representative democracy. But I suppose what one can strengthen within businesses, large and small, is a greater element of internal accountability. So some more, I think, checks and balances. And I think one can also increase forms of, if you like, a culture of cooperation rather than a culture of compliance. And I think what's interesting, even though I wouldn't defend, Apple, in terms of everything it does, because I think it's beginning, of course, to abuse its market position as well, but Apple has a lot of teamwork, which, a lot of the workers find very fulfilling. And it's not quite as hierarchical as perhaps other businesses. So I think there's a greater element of accountability and teamwork and cooperation that we can perhaps build into business models. I very much like the idea of ethical codes and everything along those lines. And in the politics of virtue, we try and develop some of this by saying actually what you need are a greater plurality of professional associations. So you have to be a member of a professional association, but you can choose which one. So there wouldn't be a single. There would be like a meta guild for one profession, but within that you can choose the association you want to belong to. For instance, in Britain we have one British Banking Association. And the reason why that hasn't worked is very obvious. It's run in the interest of the big banks. And what did the British Banking Association do? It engaged in criminal activity by manipulating LIBOR, the interbanking lending rate. That's actually the British Banking Association. Right? So clearly you couldn't have a single association, but you need something for the banking sector and then lots of associations within. And they would also be about ethical standards, not just strict professional standards. I like the idea of board members, representing the business far more. I'm not sure they should be elected by civil society institutions. That might be going a little far in some sense, but I think they should certainly represent the people who are concerned by the business much more. So I would say workers, suppliers, and perhaps also consumers, because I think they all deserve a voice on a company board. incentives and rewards is something I didn't develop much in the paper, for which I apologize since it wasn't a title. I suppose I'd say that we need to think through far more this idea of intrinsic motivation. Because it seems to me that people, of course, aren't simply motivated by altruism, just like they're also not simply motivated by egotism. These are two extremes. I think it's much more a question of, we are characterized by both virtue and vice. And it's trying to encourage the more virtues while bearing in mind that we can be capable of vice, and we need to try and limit that. So to assume that we are either totally altruistic or totally selfish, I think is wrong. But I think there is a good motivation at the heart of everyone. And yes, sin is real, but I don't think sin has completely destroyed our ability to desire and to recognize the good. And so it's about trying to build incentives and rewards to encourage that. But of course, precisely in the sense of, first of all, hoping and designing institutions that encourage that intrinsic motivation and not doing it just through extrinsic, financial or economic rewards, which is your point, of course. But I do think at the same time that contribution, because everyone does make a contribution to society, needs to be honored. So for instance, one of the great things that I find scandalous is that so much of domestic work, mostly done by women, gets absolutely no recognition anywhere. And yet we know from the work of Nancy Fraser and others that actually all of the extra economic is absolutely crucial to the operation of capitalism. Because capitalism couldn't work unless they had all these compensating mechanisms. There would be no capitalist economy if all areas of life were completely, subordinated to it. So the extra economic is now a way of sustaining capitalism, which is very perverse, but that's what's going on. Now, in order to try and transform capitalism, I think what we need is precisely to recognize that raising children, looking after the elderly, all sorts of community, family and community services are a huge contribution to society and get no recognition from anyone. So, how do we do that? I don't know, but I think that's a huge challenge for us. Are institutions vulnerable and can they be destroyed? Absolutely, it happens all the time. I think it's a genuine tragedy when it does. And yes, I think we do need to see them as part of the global commons. A lot of institutions are valuable, but they've been hollowed out. I mean, this is the point that Margaret made, to which I come back in a second. So yes, we need to be very careful. I think as countries, we've not been good at nation or institution building for some time. But absolutely, before we abandon institutions, we should try and transform them from within, because to rebuild them once they're gone is very dangerous. We see it with trade unions. They are on a long-term decline, and that's very dangerous for everyone. And all the business people who want fewer unions, should be careful what they wish for, because I think it's going to ultimately backfire and create far more conflict and disruption than they, I think, realize. So it also means preserving them and extending them, for instance, in the gig economy where they're hardly present. I think in response to Jorge, and thank you very much for your comments. I think one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking is perhaps something that needs to be clarified in the paper, and that is that I think we're seeing a kind of bifurcation. That yes, global capitalism is very real. It affects practically all parts of the world, and at the same time, a lot of everyday life still happens in ways that we could perhaps describe by this idea of a foundation economy. And people put something like between 15 and 30% of GDP as pertaining to the foundation economy, the places where we live, where we work, the people we care for. Not all of that is completely determined by global capitalism all the time. Global capitalism is clearly affecting it, but some of it remains, I think, more perhaps localized than we sometimes say. And it matters because it means it's also a basis from which one can try and build certain things. So the foundation economy, it's kind of the everyday economy of housing, food, work, and so on, I think is important to build into our analysis, because it can be both a place for resistance and for alternatives, that can be, I think, built up and scaled up. So global capitalism, while it exists and is expanding, is perhaps not the whole story. And this really goes back to the distinction between capitalism and the market. Yes, capitalism exists. We can identify its history, I think, its ideology, and so on. But there's also a market economy that was prior to it. and that in some sense still operates. It's being disrupted by capitalism, but I don't think it's been completely destroyed by it. And then, whether it's northern Italy or southern Germany or other, cases around the world, there are examples where markets can operate without globalization and global capitalism constantly disrupting everything. And I think it's the balance between the two, perhaps, that we need to bear in mind. Let me move on to some of the questions and comments that were made by others, starting with Margaret. And I think you're absolutely right. We don't mention bureaucratic regulation enough. I certainly didn't in the paper, and I don't think it's come up in the debate enough. So I agree that that's a major omission. I suppose what I'd say is that regulation, in some sense also defies our categories because it falls between the state and the market. Some of it is done by quangos in the UK or similar agencies elsewhere, which are sort of set up by states but then really deal with essentially certain market processes. So what is that? Is that public? Is that private? Is that state or market? It's very unclear. Exactly. I think it's, to use another word that's been mentioned, exactly, that's right. And I think we need to both conceptualize it and then understand how it can be transformed. And of course, the work of Gian Domenico Maggiorne on the regulatory state and many others. I mean, even going back to someone like James Burnham, who wrote about the managerialist revolution in 1941, I think is very, very instructive. And I think you're absolutely right to say that it's those sorts of institutions and the policies that they promote which turns us into instrumental rationalists. We're not that by nature, but those structures turn us into that. But if that's the case, then we can also change it. And I think you're right, we need to think through how we can tackle bureaucratic regulation. I think the main reason why it's expanded so much in the last 20, 30, 40 years is because we've seen an extension of the market into all sorts of areas. And we know from both theory and practice, Carl Polanyi to, privatization and deregulation, actually when you expand the market, you also expand certain forms of state power or certain forms of regulation which are sort of in between. Why? Because market can create certain forms of anarchy, and you always need forms of control. And of course, the market doesn't operate in a vacuum. It needs to be extended into new areas, and when you privatize, you also regulate. So privatization actually often leads to more regulation than before, and I think that's part of the story of the last 40 years. But I think that's very, very important. Stefano, thank you very much for your two comments. I think you're absolutely right. Antitrust is handled very differently, and I think it's probably also a cultural question. What I find fascinating in the US is that whilst the tradition of antitrust was a lot stronger at the beginning of the 20th century with Standard Oil, and then again at the time of...
Sorry, but we have a general discussion, and in the time the general discussion is at 6:30, so it's impossible to continue with your relation. Maybe there are interests to speak about other things.
I just need 3 more minutes. So I agree with you. I think there's a history since the 70s of abandoning antitrust policies in the States in favor of, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, economic liberalism. And I think we can trace that history quite well now. The point I want to make is that you're absolutely right. We don't choose the conditions in which we make consumer choices. Zygmunt Bauman put this well. Freedom of choice is great, but the conditions under which choices are made are not themselves a matter of choice. That's the problem. I could try and say something about the other points that were made, but maybe I should stop here, and if there's time at the end, before 7:30, I'll come back to them. But thank you all for your comments. They were very, very helpful.
Muchas gracias a usted, profesor. Bueno, entonces tenemos la oportunidad ahora de vuestras intervenciones en este espacio de discusión general. ¿Quién desea participar? Jorge Arturo, por favor.
Gracias. Nada más a propósito de las intervenciones de la profesora Margaret y del profesor Stefano y otras cosas que se dijeron ayer también. A mí me va quedando más claro, no sé a ustedes, que otro paso siguiente para este tema de este workshop, porque supongo que aquí no se agota todo, es el matizar mejor, a propósito de lo que ellos dicen continuamente, Estados Unidos es así, Europa es asá, y dónde queda América Latina y el tercer mundo. Me parece que él no se ha enfatizado tampoco, ha estado ausente, quitando todavía aún más, gracias, Monseñor. Entonces creo que es indispensable matizar más que esa relación tripartita no se da igual en todas partes a pesar de la globalización. Vuelvo a lo que decía el profesor Bruni. Yo sí creo que, por ejemplo, en América Latina, el tema de la gobernanza, la ausencia de mejorar la gobernanza corporativa y la participación popular en la definición de políticas públicas es clave. Entonces, agradezco mucho cuando dicen, bueno, en Estados Unidos es así, en Europa es asá. ¿Cómo queda el tercer mundo? Creo que hay un workshop coming, is another coming workshop on the third world and the Latin America, esta misma relación tripartita, yo creo que es indispensable retomarla también desde esta otra perspectiva.
Gracias, Jorge Arturo. Monseñor.
Yo creo que en un mundo que tenemos 80 millones de víctimas de tráfico, que tenemos el clima, la crisis del clima que se está agravando cada vez más. Los últimos estudios de Ramanathan, del equipo de la academia, que son los que pusieron el tema del clima hace 20 años, están diciendo que las cosas se han agravado porque no se ha seguido para nada la COP21. Es decir, no creo que estos temas tan graves que el Papa hoy ha hablado y no hace más que repetir todas las veces que pueda, se pueden simplificar así con estas soluciones muy parciales. Yo creo que lo que ha dicho Jeffrey Sachs, en definitiva, tenemos un gran problema y no tenemos una gran solución al momento. Yo creo que esta es realmente la clave que nosotros tenemos que concluir, porque verdaderamente no veo que estas soluciones que se van presentando, ni siquiera el caso europeo, porque el caso europeo está a la rastra de los otros casos.
Gracias, Monseñor. ¿Alguien más desea intervenir en este espacio? Creo que se está levantando como una agenda de puntos prioritarios a seguir abordando. Tenemos todavía tiempo de hacerlo en este día que queda. Pero bueno, está abierta las contribuciones. Profesor, adelante. Usted.
I do always the provocative side. I made an FAO conference with my students of development economics. We have only 4 Italians. Most of them come from Africa, Asia. Okay, there are 50 countries. And when we made this discussion, anyone had to present something of their own country. And I was shocked by the fact that the best practice are the same everywhere. Vegetable garden, social business is going to be the same. The frontier are the same everywhere. And for example, Luigino talks about economy of communion. Economy of communion was born in Brazil. So I don't think that we have, I mean, even in social business, we have some frontier like health budgets, housing first. These are frontier. These are the best way, wherever they're born, these are today the best thing we have to solve specific problem. Housing first is an idea.
2/3 de la población en Brasil viven en villas miserias. 2/3 de la población en Brasil viven en villas miserias, donde no tienen agua, donde no tienen educación, donde no tienen hospitales. Todo eso es pequeñas experiencias.
No, I know. I'm saying that we have a frontier of what are the best practices in doing some things. Whether these best practices are adopted everywhere, this is not not going on now, But we are 20, 30 years that we are living what is called conditional convergence. In the last 20 years, the developing countries are growing at a higher pace than developed countries. And that's what's creating the problem in our countries, because China is growing more, India is growing more. These countries are, even the average rate of growth of Africa is higher. The problem is inequality within the same country. The problem is that there is incredible inequality within each country, few rich and many poor. But on average, so the real question we have to address is inequality, but and of course environmental sustainability. But I'm saying okay. The problem is this. For example, take environmental sustainability. We still think that this can be a solution of agreement among countries. It would be perfect. The problem is sovereign states have nothing above them, so overordinated. And then when they make some kind of decision, if one state change idea, no one can tell anything. We cannot tell anything to Trump. There's not a court which can punish Trump because he went out of that. Where do we have the possibility of creating a positive situation? Within countries. If I am the Italian government, or the Brazilian government or whatever, and if I put a consumption tax which penalizes non-sustainable car, houses, whatever, I have the power to enforce them because I have the court, I am the government, and they are my citizens. So I think the only way we have is that one. Of course, if some country do and some other do not, but I really think that the change today, it's much more likely that it can come from individual states, from grassroots, from sustainable corporation, and then can be adopted by government. I'm very skeptical that government can do something. That's my my opinion, because there's nothing above government that can impose something. That's the problem, and we saw with the United States. So I have much more hope for what comes out from the bottom. But
muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más desea intervenir? Monseñor.
Lo que viene de la base es lo que dicen de arriba. Acá vale lo que decía Kierkegaard, cuando decía que el cocinero había tomado el micrófono y entonces daba el menú de lo que había que comer, pero no de dónde iba el barco. Y eso es lo que pasó con muchos gobiernos, que la base hay que formarla.
En plus es que la base es manipulada. So, habemos un gran problema de comunicación, de manipulación de la comunicación. Ese es un problema ulterior. Sí.
Bien, muchas gracias. Creo que estamos llegando al final de la jornada de hoy.
Hacer una agenda sobre al menos las cosas que aquí se han hablado, posibles soluciones, tal vez no es la única solución o la definitiva, pero una agenda, en la conclusión, una agenda de las soluciones que se han ido proponiendo, aparte del problema. En la conclusión.
¿Quién le pone el cascabel al gato?
Bueno, cada uno ha propuesto acá distintas cosas y esas se pueden poner, tienen el valor relativo.
En ese sentido, una recomendación quizás a la relatoría sería si quizás para la jornada de mañana podrían irse ubicando algunos de los puntos principales y podemos concentrar la discusión en esa agenda, ¿no? Creo que esa agenda podría ser como un resultado muy valiosa esta reunión. Profesor Ricardo.
Yo creo que el punto de partida es que no tenemos un problema y no podemos tener la expectativa de una solución. Y entonces el problema es que cuando se presenta la multiplicidad de soluciones, la impresión que esto provoca es de una fragilidad inmensa. El arte, me parece, está justamente en una articulación de estas soluciones que son muy variadas, muy ricas, algunas que emergen de las bases de la sociedad, de los pobres, de los oprimidos, otras que emergen de las empresas, incluso de los gobiernos, algunos gobiernos locales, etc. ¿Y cómo vamos a articular esto? Mi impresión es que esta articulación pasa fundamentalmente por la exposición de valores. Hoy nosotros no estamos en condición, como generación 2017, de tener la ambición de presentar un programa de transformación global. Pero sí, sobre todo, en esta institución tenemos las condiciones de presentar un conjunto de valores y llenar estos valores con prácticas sociales diversificadas que pueden nos conducir a algo muy diferente de lo que estamos viviendo hoy.
Muy importante el tema de los valores y también procesos. Creo que lo que se está dando cuenta en estas reuniones son estos procesos, ¿no?, que tienen su valor y que hay que, digamos, tenerlos en cuenta, ¿no? Pues bueno, pues tengamos estos elementos en mente y el día de mañana tratemos de enfocarnos en función de esa agenda. En todo caso, no sé si me corresponde a mí o no, pues agradecer la reunión del día de hoy, creo que ha sido muy fructífera, agradecer a nuestras intérpretes y creo que pasamos a la cena, ¿verdad? Muchas gracias.